All right, here we are again. This is lecture 33, and what we're going to talk about today is corporations and the robber barons. Now, this is going to be kind of a little bit of a change of pace here, because we're noticing that we talked about industrialization, and yes, I know I talked in depth on industrialization, and I still didn't cover it all. There will be some stuff that I'm going to have to pick up later on. Hopefully this one isn't going to be quite so long. But either way, I wanted to kind of talk about the essential institution that was really kind of driving and also becoming empowered by the industrial age, the second industrial age. And this kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into my particular point of view as I'm studying history. Those of you who know me, who have been in my class, you know my background. Those who haven't, I'm a sociologist, so I study history from a somewhat different perspective than do others. I link historical phenomenon to social phenomenon. So for me, it's very important to understand how historical elements play into who we are today and our sense of and our social self today. That's kind of my perspective here, and I study power and how power arrangements develop in a society and the consequences of that. So this was kind of my chance to kind of go into a little bit of sociology, not too much, but a little bit of sociology in talking about corporations as an institution and what became known later on as the robber barons. We'll explain exactly what that means in just a moment. So anyway, this is lecture 33. And what we're going to do today is we're going to analyze the impact of the rise of the corporation on U.S. society, economy, and politics. So this idea of rise of the corporation may not necessarily be the way some historians would look at this period, but looking at it from a sociological point of view and looking at it as someone who is interested in institutions and how they impact society, this is an interpretation of this period that we can apply. It is not the interpretation, but it is certainly a interpretation. Of course, this corresponds with Key Concept 6.1.1c in your AP guide. So first of all, before we even go on, we have to define our terms, right? So exactly what is a corporation? And in essence, a corporation, well, not in essence, in reality, a corporation is a business owned by shareholders. It's a little bit, it goes from about a partnership beyond that, all right? So what ends up happening is if you have a corporation, what you've done is your corporation has a certain amount of shares or stocks, shares that can be owned. Those shares may be owned by just you, or it may be owned by 10,000 other people. So, but either way, the corporation is divided up into shares. So what does that do? Well, what that does is, or some of the benefits of this particular arrangement is it's a really good way of encouraging investment. Instead of having a partnership and going through all that, all you do is you sell your shares. You sell your shares out to people who are willing to invest in your particular corporation. Remember, some of these corporations, especially in the industrial age, they were about you building factories and large factories of production, and these factories were oftentimes very, very expensive. So if you by yourself wanted to build a factory and you wanted to do it out of pocket, well, it might take you 90% of your savings and 90% of your wealth to build that factory, 75% of your wealth. Well, if your business fails, you're out that money. Game over. And most people are not willing to take quite that risk. But if you can get 1,000 people together to invest, to purchase shares in your company, in your corporation, well, then that makes it a little bit easier, because now instead of you being out 75% of your wealth, then you're maybe out only 10% if the business fails or whatever. So it's a good way of attracting capital, and also it's a good way of assessing the value of your particular investment, because if you try to sell shares in your company and nobody's willing to buy them, nobody's willing to invest in your company, you might not have a great idea, in front of you. So you might want to change some things up. But if you do have a great idea, then a lot of people are going to be willing to invest, and you're going to be able to build the capital that you need to develop your infrastructure and develop your factors of production. So one thing is the corporation is a really good way of attracting capital. And attracting investment. One of the things that makes it a good way of attracting capital and investment is corporations tend to minimize the risk that investors have going in. So if you're an investor, you're looking for a place to invest, you're going to invest in a corporation. But since you are simply a shareholder, which means you're entitled to a certain amount of dividends, if for whatever reason something happens to that corporation, you're not responsible for making up the losses. You are responsible for, you're going to be out whatever you put into the corporation. But anything that you took out, you don't have to pay back, you don't have to give back. It all devolves onto the corporation. So it allows for a certain, it mitigates some risk, which is another way of encouraging investment. Also, the fact that you get large numbers of people to pool their resources into one corporate entity, that means that you might have shares here and here all over the place, and a loss in one area may be mitigated by gains in another area. Again, these are things that are going to minimize risk for investors. And also, it's a way of organizing the work that needs to be done. You create a corporation, a corporate board. You hire executives to run your company. These executives are usually experts in what they do, and then they go on and they hire and promote managers who are also experts in what they do, and hopefully you get top quality and highly skilled people doing the work throughout the company for the company, and it all goes up to the top, all goes up to the shareholders. And these guys are responsible. They have to make decisions in the best interest of their shareholders. It's the law. They actually literally have to make their decisions based on the best interest of their shareholders. Now, some important elements of this, the late 19th century could be seen as kind of a golden age, or an age of empowerment for this particular institutional body. And it's really strange to think of it that way, but institutions are a way of organizing people's ability to do work. And consequently, they are a way of organizing power within society. And corporations are able to do that. And there's some elements that are going to happen in the late 19th century. We could talk about corporations going all the way back to the 13th century. But what is it about corporations in the 19th century? What was this huge expansion of corporate power and corporate influence in the 19th century, or what made it a little bit different? And during this time, we also have to think about, there were a couple of Supreme Court cases that came about in the 19th century. I'm not going to get into the details of the specifics of them, but the two main ones here are Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, and the Pembina Consolidated Silver Mining Company versus Pennsylvania. And between these two Supreme Court cases, what ended up happening is that illegally, according to the Supreme Court, corporations had to be treated as people under the 14th Amendment. In other words, corporations, just like people, were offered equal protection under the laws. And that's kind of a weird concept, because legally, clearly corporations are not people, right? And yet, legally, they have to be treated as people to a certain extent as a result of these two and other Supreme Court cases. Of course, this has been expanded of late. This definition has been expanded of late, and it's highly controversial. And it's been controversial for over 100 years, 130 years. Now, corporations. Now, think about this for a second. Now, one of the things that corporations. Let's say I was the owner and chief executive officer of a widget corporation, right? I'm selling widgets. Everybody needs widgets. Widgets are a great thing, and I'm selling my widgets. Well, what does that mean? It means that I have to attract customers. I have to attract people to purchase my widgets, and that means that I'm going to have to, sell a relatively high quality product for a relatively low price, because there are other people out there who are selling widgets, and I have to compete with them. Now, optimally, if I had my choice, I would produce the cheapest possible product for the highest possible price that I could get, and still get people to purchase my stuff, right? But now that I have all these different competitors out there, it means that I'm going to have to increase the quality of my product and lower my prices so that I'm competitive. So, quite frankly, even though competition is kind of a foundational element of capitalism, as a modern capitalist, quite frankly, I hate competition. I don't benefit from that. So what I might be inclined to do as the leader of a widget company is, instead of competing with all of my widget competitors, I might be inclined to go to those folks and say, hey, instead of competing, Why don't we work together? And that way there, we can set our own prices and decide upon our own quality product, and we can even control wages among people who work and help us to build these widgets. So I might do that, and what we'll do is we'll get about 5 or 10 of our widget companies, and instead of competing with each other, we will form one giant mega corporation called a trust. We will pretty much funnel all of our decision making through a trust that runs and siphons down through all the companies. So this is a trust. And so that's basically when you have multiple corporations that are working together to control a particular market. That's where you have a trust. And of course, we've talked about monopolies earlier, where monopolies are business interests that control a market. Well, a trust is a really, really great way to create a monopoly. Another way of doing it is, let's say I have a really big widget company, and what I could do is I could just purchase a whole bunch of smaller widget companies, or I could actually combine my widget company with one other huge widget company and make one Mondo widget company. Anytime you're combining these businesses as one entity, that is called a merger. Another thing that I can do is I might want to be on the board of directors of other companies that are related to my particular company, and that way there I have a say-so in what other companies are doing, and I also have an inside track on what decisions are being made by other companies. So if I'm on the board of directors of Andosha Widget Company and then Smith Widget Company and some other widget company, or maybe I'm on the board of directors of companies that feed into my widget company, then I have a greater say over what's going on within the marketplace, and this is called an interlocking directorate. So these are all ways by which the corporation, corporations are being empowered in very, very different ways in the late 19th century than they were really ever before, historically speaking. Yeah, we could talk about some of the East India Company and things along those lines, but this is really a qualitatively different experience that we're seeing happening here. So now some structures with regard to trust. As you can see here, this is a really interesting image here, and this shows what I was just talking about with regard to trust. All of my widget companies are down here, and they all kind of work together in one large trust. This is known as horizontal integration. All right, and so for instance, now who knows what widgets are, right? But let's take a real-life example. We could say in the 19th century, we could see a company like Standard Oil. So that what Standard Oil would do is Standard Oil would pretty much control and buy interest in other oil companies, so that it got to the point where if you were buying oil in the United States, you were probably going to have to buy it from Standard Oil. What they could do... and some of these business practices, by the way, were pretty insidious. So what happened is you had John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil, and one of the ways that he used to try to control other businesses or try to gain other businesses is because he was so large, he could negotiate lower transportation costs for his particular oil. With railroads, whereas smaller oil companies couldn't negotiate those lower rates. So what happened is Rockefeller's Standard Oil was able to ship its oil at a cheaper rate, and therefore was able to outcompete any smaller companies. Well, eventually those smaller companies, if they can't compete, they're just going to sell out, and they're going to sell to Rockefeller and sell to Standard Oil, and pretty soon Standard Oil pretty much controlled oil production in the United States. It's not going to last for very long. We'll talk about that later on. But this is an example of horizontal integration. This is a really good chart here. Now, another way of organizing this is something that's called vertical integration. We have horizontal integration, and now we can see something called vertical integration. And what vertical integration is when one company controls all processes of the production process. All stages of the production process, I should say. So an example of this might be Carnegie Steel. Carnegie owned a steel trust, or ran a steel trust, and Carnegie was famous for controlling all aspects of steel production. He controlled everything from the iron mines and the chromium mines, all the way up through how we're going to ship these mines to and from the factories. Storage, warehouses, manufacturing, how we're going to create the steel and shape the steel and produce the steel and create the parts, delivering those parts, the steel and whatever, and all of this is coming under one big main company. So this is vertical integration. So you have two different ideas: horizontal integration, controlling all of the companies in a particular market, and then vertical integration is controlling all of those areas related to the production process of your particular product. So we see that here as well. This is actually a political cartoon that shows Standard Oil. I should probably be a better better idea to put this in the other frame, but that's okay. It works out here as well. So if we take a look at this really great political cartoon. I don't know if you can make it out. You can see where it says Standard Oil. This is an oil, container here, and it shows Standard Oil as this great octopus that's kind of reaching out and grabbing up all of its competitors and just kind of sucking them in. Now, because of this, you can kind of see. According to John Murray in the textbook, John Murray, and in the textbook Liberty, Equality, and Power, he says that a weak federal government, of course we know that the federal government at this point does not have an awful lot of laws regulating the conduct of business, a weak federal government and a conservative Supreme Court set few limits on corporations in this period, despite significant antitrust agitation in the 1880s and 1890s. By then, many Americans feared the power wielded by tycoons who would establish monopolies or monopoly market shares. Alrighty? Holy cow. So you have, let's face it. Take a look at John D. Rockefeller and his control of the oil production in the country. And don't forget, in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, oil was, if you wanted to, it was oil or coal. That was it. So if you wanted to use oil, you had to do business with Standard Oil. That's an awful lot of power that these folks have. And being able to use that power, we're going to talk about politics of the Gilded Age in a later, probably, I don't think next lecture, but the lecture after that, I believe, somewhere along those lines. And just think about how much influence that these guys here have over politics. If I build one of my huge factory trusts in your district, and you're a representative of that district, I'm going to start funding your campaigns. I'm going to encourage people to work for you, but I'm also going to be hiring people in your district and hopefully making lives better for people in your district. So I'm going to expect that you're going to give me what I want. And these are referred to as the robber barons. So if we take a look at this image here, this gives you an idea of what exactly is meant by these robber barons. This is a image that comes from Puck magazine, which was kind of a left-leaning magazine in the late 19th century, and you can kind of see what's going on. If we take a look at this image here, you see that this is an image of peasants in a, let me see if I can get this, move this over here. I just can't, huh? Oh, there it is. Oh, that's how you do it. All right, so you have your landed gentry, your barons over here to the left, and you have your peasants over here to the right. And they're kind of giving their wealth over to the barons. And then when you take a look at this, you see very much the same thing happening right here. You see these folks here, who are they're the peasants, modern day peasants, I guess you could say. They're workers. This guy here appears to be somewhat middle class, but either way, they're all kind of giving their wares in the form of wages and taxes and mortgage payments and things like that to our buddies here on in the trusts. And of course, taking a look closer at this, these Puck political cartoons usually have a lot going on. But what's going on here? You've got they're using legislation, so they're actually able to influence our laws. We'll talk about how they're doing that later on to get the things that they want, to see the things that they want. One of the fascinating things is So what we're seeing here is we're seeing that people according to this secondary source and according to this primary source, we're using two sources here, we see that there's a lot of folks are a little bit unsettled by, and in fact very unsettled by the amount of power that corporations are building and developing at this time. Some of the more noted robber barons of the time include J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Jay Gould, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. I used to live in Rhode Island, and I used to be able to visit these guys' summer houses in Rhode Island, and some of these summer houses were about the size of this school. They were quite something. But anyway, J.P. Morgan here. If you needed financing to start your company up, J.P. Morgan was perfectly happy to do that. By the way, J.P. Morgan companies are still around. Morgan Stanley. These guys are still around. For the most part. And don't forget the name J.P. Morgan. We're going to talk about him again later on. John D. Rockefeller, we've already talked about. One of his statements is, "I would rather earn 1% off 100 people's efforts than 100% off of my own." Kind of gives you a little idea. I mean, the reality is that it's people working for him and investing in his company that helps him make his money, and he knows that. It's okay with him. This is John D. Rockefeller. He ran Standard Oil Company, Standard Oil Trust. Andrew Carnegie, whom we talked about. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in just a second, running the steel. And Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt, both railroad tycoons. And you can imagine that during this time, running the railroads was a really, really powerful position. There were no airplanes. There were no, delivery trucks and things along those lines. There was no internet. If you wanted to get your product from point A to point B, you had to put it on the railroad. There was no other song and dance in town. That was the way to do it. So these guys were pretty good. Jay Gould, of course, is pretty hideous. I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half, or what do I care about the law? And I got power. So this guy gives you an idea of some of the power that these guys had and the arrogance that kind of went along with that power. But take a look at Andrew Carnegie here. Now, he's got a little bit of a different idea, right? Let's take a closer look at him. Andrew Carnegie, of course, don't forget, he was a pretty ruthless businessman. Let's not candy coat this anymore. But actually, he's famous for saying the man who dies rich dies disgraced. Holy cow, what does he say? Well, actually, remember we talked about the gospel of wealth in the last lecture, one of the last lectures, and we talked about how it was pretty much just a restatement of social Darwinism, the idea that the wealthy are wealthy because they are the most fit, and the poor are poor because they're stupid, and there's really nothing you do. Well, Andrew Carnegie actually is going to write his own idea of the gospel of wealth. And what he understands is that really having too much wealth is really just not healthy. And that having enough money to get by on and to live comfortably is fine, but anything in excess of that should be invested back into the community to make for a better community. And that seemed to be his philosophy. How far did he live by this? Well, you'd have to be the judge. But among Carnegie, of course, had many charities that he participated in, and this is something. This kind of becomes an age of philanthropy, especially as these guys start getting older and closer to their appointment with the pearly gates, so to speak. A lot of them started to see, maybe I need to start getting into some people's good graces. So they started to fund endowments that went to different things: the arts, education, science, diplomacy and freedom and things along those lines. So I'm not going to go through all of these particular institutions, but what's significant about these institutions is that they're all examples of philanthropy. They're all examples of endeavors taken up by the robber barons to kind of give back to the communities from which they were enriched, which is kind of a nice idea. Now, of course, we could be kind of cynical about this and suggest, well, maybe some of these endowments are actually stuff that made life better for rich people and not necessarily for poor people. The Carnegie Hall, being an example here. But not necessarily. And maybe things that make society better as a whole, better is better, right? So we can't rule out this philanthropic aspect. And we also have to think about the the idea of, well, yes, there was a tremendous amount of exploitation that took place as a result of the actions of the robber barons. We're going to talk about that more specifically as we go along. But also there was a tremendous amount of wealth that was produced in the nation as a whole. The debate continues as to whether or not the United States as a society is better off for the work of the robber barons, or did this constitute a theft that could have been handled in other ways, or could have developed in other ways? Well, history doesn't give us its alternatives, but it's an interesting speculation. So until next time, we'll go into other stuff next time.